Chapter 1. The Frost Upon the Panes. It has ever been my belief, one formed across years of quiet observation within the cluttered sitting room at 221B Baker Street, that the true character of Sherlock Holmes is revealed most vividly not during the breathless crescendo of a chase, but in the long grey hours of anticipation, those stagnant interludes between cases when the coal fire burned low and the London fog pressed like a damp shroud against the window panes, tested his restless intellect far more severely than any criminal enterprise. It was the second week of November in the year of our Lord 1888. A bitter, bone-chilling frost had descended upon the metropolis overnight, turning the mud of the thoroughfares into iron and encrusting the window sashes with delicate fern-like crystals of ice. Within our sanctuary, however, the atmosphere was thick with the acrid, chemical-laden reek of an experiment involving coal tar derivatives, an endeavor that had driven me to seek the shelter of my armchair with a volume of Clark Russell and a briar pipe long since gone cold. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the worn Persian rug directly before the hearth, his long, nervous fingers manipulating a pair of brass forceps with absolute precision. He wore an old frayed dressing gown of a deep claret hue, his shirt collar unbuttoned, and his sharp aquiline profile cast long, grotesque shadows against the wallpaper as the flames flickered. For 3 hours he had scarcely uttered a word, save for an occasional low murmur of intellectual satisfaction whenever a precipitate formed within his glass retort. "You are unusually quiet this morning, Watson," he remarked suddenly, without so much as lifting his eyes from the boiling liquid. "Your pipe has been unlit for 20 minutes, yet you continue to draw upon it with the stubborn persistence of a man attempting to coax life from a drowned kitten. Furthermore, your left thumb bears a faint smudge of printer's ink, fresh ink, imported from Fleet Street, suggesting you have been casting a critical eye over the morning broadsheets before I had even unfolded them." I could not suppress a quiet smile as I laid my book across my knee. "Your perception is as infallible as ever, Holmes, though it scarcely requires the intellect of a master detective to deduce that a medical man might glance at the lancet while waiting for his companion to surface from his chemical purgatory." "Ah, but the ink smudge is upon the second phalanx, not the tip," Holmes countered, his dark eyes flashing with a momentary amusement as he set his forceps aside and rose with the lithe, effortless grace of an athlete. A smudge upon the tip would indicate hurried turning of the political columns. The second phalanx points unequivocally to the medical abstracts, specifically the monograph concerning nervous disorders in retired Indian officers. Am I correct? "Precisely," I sighed, shaking my head, "though I confess it sometimes grows wearisome to live in the immediate vicinity of an omniscient machine." Holmes chuckled, a dry, rasping sound, and stepped toward the window, pressing his palm against the glass to melt a small circle through the frost. He peered out into Baker Street, where a few muffled pedestrians hurried past through the swirling grey mist, their breath pluming white in the freezing air. The street lamps were still sputtering yellow gas against the gloom, casting long, wavering halos over the cobblestones. "The city sleeps beneath a shroud of ice, Watson, yet beneath that frozen crust, the vast, grinding machinery of human depravity never ceases its rotation," Holmes murmured, his tone shifting imperceptibly from playful banter to that cool, detached intensity that always signaled the approach of a problem worthy of his mettle. "Observe that cabman struggling with his offside trace leather near the corner of Marylebone Road. The man is shivering violently, yet he has taken the time to secure a sprig of withered heather beneath his lapel, a curious adornment for a common hackney driver on a freezing London morning, unless he has recently conveyed a passenger from the Scottish Highlands or seeks to commemorate a superstitious journey." Before I could frame a reply regarding the habits of London cabmen, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed upon the outer door below. It was not the tentative tap of a nervous petitioner, nor the heavy, rhythmic thud of the postman, but a rapid, double strike delivered with the unmistakable impatience of a person accustomed to absolute obedience and accustomed to waiting for no man. Holmes paused, his hand hovering over his pipe rack. He cocked his head, listening intently as Mrs. Hudson's heavy footsteps creaked along the linoleum of the passage, followed by the murmur of a deep, resonant voice that seemed entirely unsuited to the impoverished petitioners who usually climbed our 17 steps. "A client, Holmes," I observed, straightening my waistcoat with instinctive professional pride. "A client of unusual quality, Watson," Holmes corrected quietly, his eyes bright with sudden curiosity. "Note the timbre of the voice. It belongs to a man of 40-odd years, possessed of a robust constitution that has recently suffered some severe moral or physical shock. He breathes through his nose with slight difficulty, a deviated septum, likely the result of an old injury sustained in his youth, perhaps upon the playing fields of Eton or Harrow, and his boots struck the lower hall with a heel-and-toe cadence peculiar to men who have spent their formative years in the military service abroad, yet whose present station requires the quiet tread of diplomacy or high finance." The door of our sitting room swung open, and Mrs. Hudson stood upon the threshold, her round face flushed with a mixture of excitement and mild indignation. "If you please, Mr. Holmes," she began, smoothing her apron with agitation, "there is a gentleman below who insists upon seeing you immediately. He would not wait to leave his card with me, nor would he state his business, despite my telling him that you were engaged in private scientific pursuits. He simply brushed past me upon the stairs with the air of a man who owns the building." "Let him enter, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said smoothly, his voice dropping into that calm, measured register that always warned me he was preparing to test an adversary. "His haste is entirely excusable. The cold outside is formidable, and our visitor appears to have traveled a considerable distance this morning before the gas lamps were extinguished." Mrs. Hudson sniffed slightly, stepped aside, and the stranger materialized in our doorway. He was a striking figure who instantly filled the modest dimensions of our parlor with an imposing physical presence. Taller than Holmes by a full inch, he stood perhaps 6 feet and 2 inches, with broad, square shoulders that strained against the dark, heavy wool of a magnificent Inverness cape lined with quilted silk. His face was deeply bronzed by exposure to fierce tropical suns, not the pale, sickly yellow of the returning Anglo-Indian civil servant, but the rugged, weather-beaten bronze of a man who spent his life upon the veldt or the rolling decks of a warship. A thick, dark moustache, carefully trimmed at the corners, shadowed a mouth set in lines of grim determination, and his eyes, a piercing, cold slate grey, swept rapidly about the room, taking in every detail with the dispassionate efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. Yet it was not his imposing stature or his military bearing that caused my breath to catch in my throat. It was the absolute composure with which he looked directly at my companion, without a single flicker of surprise at the chemical apparatus, the tobacco-strewn table, or the eccentricities of our lodgings. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," the stranger said, his voice deep, resonant, and touched with an accent that was difficult to place, somewhere between the clipped vowels of the English shires and the broader cadence of the colonial frontier. He did not extend a hand, but merely inclined his head with a stiff, formal courtesy. "And Dr. John Watson, I take it. It is an unexpected privilege to find you both at leisure on so foul a morning." I felt a sudden chill run down my spine, quite independent of the frost upon the window. In all our years in Baker Street, I could scarcely recall a single instance where a stranger had walked through our door and addressed me by name without prior introduction or the traditional preamble of astonishment at Holmes's eccentricities. Holmes, however, did not betray the slightest trace of surprise. He merely leaned against the mantelpiece, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his claret-colored dressing gown, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the newcomer with the intense clinical detachment of an anatomist examining a rare specimen. "You are remarkably well informed for a gentleman who has evidently just stepped off the morning express from Dover, or perhaps Southampton," Holmes remarked, his tone light, conversational, and edged with a subtle, razor-sharp steel. "Your boots retain a microscopic residue of chalk mixed with damp red clay, a geological combination found exclusively in the southern coastal cliffs near the Isle of Wight or the chalk downs of Sussex. Furthermore, the buttons of your Inverness cape are fastened on the left side in the manner of garments tailored in Cape Town, yet the cloth itself is of Huddersfield manufacture, heavy enough to withstand an English winter. You arrived in London by the early boat train, you engaged a four-wheeler at Waterloo Station, and you directed the driver to take the route across Westminster Bridge rather than Charing Cross, doubtless to avoid the congestion near the market." The stranger's heavy moustache twitched slightly, and for the fraction of a second, A flicker of genuine astonishment crossed his weathered features, though he mastered it instantly. "You read me like an open primer, Mr. Holmes, just as the legends proclaimed," the visitor said, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Yet for all your marvelous deductions concerning my boots and my railway route, there is one small circumstance regarding my identity that you have curiously omitted to mention. Or perhaps you already know my name?" Holmes withdrew his hands from his pockets and stepped forward, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. He did not smile. Instead, his gaze hardened, locking onto the stranger's grey eyes with an intensity that made the very air in the room seem to crackle with tension. "I do not make a habit of guessing the names of men who deliberately conceal them beneath fictitious coats of arms and borrowed credentials," Holmes said softly, "though I should imagine that a gentleman who takes the trouble to remove the maker's label from the interior pocket of his cape would scarcely wish to be addressed by his true title upon a first meeting, particularly when that title is associated with an unfortunate tragedy at sea 3 nights ago." The stranger's expression froze. The color drained slightly from his bronzed cheeks, and his right hand dropped instinctively toward the heavy pocket of his cape. "Tragedy at sea?" I echoed, springing to my feet in alarm. "Holmes, what on earth are you talking about?" "I am speaking, Watson," Holmes replied without taking his eyes off our visitor, "of the steamship Norfolk, which foundered off the Needles in a blinding snow squall at midnight on Tuesday, carrying to the bottom a cargo valued at £200,000 in government bonds, and one passenger who appears to have reached Baker Street ahead of the survivors." The visitor stood entirely motionless for a moment, the silence in the room so absolute that the ticking of the mantelpiece clock sounded like the hammer of a distant forge. Then, slowly, a low, humorless laugh escaped his lips, and he drew his hand from his pocket, revealing an empty palm. "You are more dangerous than they told me, Mr. Holmes," the stranger said quietly, "and the game, I perceive, has already begun." Chapter 2: The Weight of an Unrecorded Name. The sudden declaration hung in the stagnant, chemical-laden air of our sitting room like a physical presence. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the brass carriage clock upon the mantelpiece, and the occasional hiss of a melting coal within the grate. Outside, the distant, muffled rattle of a dray horse's hooves against the frozen cobblestones of Baker Street served as a stark reminder of the bustling, oblivious world that continued its ordinary rotation just beyond our windows. Holmes remained motionless by the fireplace, his tall, spare frame silhouetted against the amber glow, his sharp, dark eyes fixed immovably upon our enigmatic visitor. The stranger, for his part, did not flinch under that piercing scrutiny. Instead, he slowly withdrew his hand from the deep pocket of his Inverness cape, letting the heavy wool fall back into place with a dull, muffled thud, and met my companion's gaze with an expression of grim, resolute composure. "A tragedy at sea, Mr. Holmes," the stranger repeated, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the silence with deliberate cadence. It is a convenient phrase, neatly encompassing the loss of timbers, canvas, iron, and unfortunate souls. Yet it lacks a certain essential precision, an omission which, I should imagine, must deeply offend a mind so devoted to exactitude as your own. Precision is indeed a commodity I strive to maintain, particularly when dealing with matters that involve government securities and nocturnal shipwrecks, Holmes replied smoothly, stepping away from the mantelpiece and gesturing toward the worn leather armchair opposite my own. "Pray be seated, sir. The morning air of the Channel is notoriously unkind to the lungs, and you have clearly endured a considerable exposure to the elements before favoring us with your company. Watson, be so good as to push the coal scuttle closer to our guest." I muttered an affirmative and nudged the heavy brass scuttle forward with the toe of my boot, though my professional instincts as a medical man were warring fiercely with my curiosity as an observer. The visitor's complexion, while weathered, carried beneath its bronze a dull, ashen pallor around the edges of the nostrils and the corners of the eyes, the unmistakable physiological signature of acute physical exhaustion, coupled with the profound nervous strain that accompanies a brush with mortal peril. The stranger did not immediately accept the seat. He unfastened the top clasp of his cape, allowing the heavy garment to part and reveal the dark, impeccably tailored tweed coat beneath. A heavy gold watch chain spanned his waistcoat, from which depended a single unadorned quartz seal that caught the flickering firelight. He looked down at the empty armchair, then cast a brief calculating glance around our cluttered apartment, not with the idle curiosity of a tourist, but with the rapid sweeping appraisal of a man cataloguing exits, cover, and potential threats. "I thank you, Doctor." "Watson," the stranger said finally, his eyes returning to Holmes as he lowered his bulk into the leather chair with a controlled athletic grace. "However, I fear that sitting down will not make my errand any shorter, nor will it diminish the urgency of the catastrophe that has brought me to your door. You spoke of the Norfolk, you spoke of government bonds, you even deduced that I reached London ahead of the official survivors. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, did your extraordinary deductive faculties also inform you of why I am here?" Holmes seated himself upon the edge of the horsehair sofa, lacing his long fingers together across his knee. A faint, enigmatic smile touched the corners of his thin lips. "To judge by the absence of a wet weather overcoat, the haste with which you engaged your four-wheeler, and the peculiar fact that you carry no luggage whatsoever beyond a gold pocket watch and a pocketbook stuffed with damp papers, I should say you are here because you are a hunted man," Holmes answered calmly. "Furthermore, you are hunted not merely by the ordinary minions of Scotland Yard, who are doubtless already investigating the disaster at the Needles, but by an adversary far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous, an adversary who knows that the sinking of the Norfolk was not an act of God or the carelessness of an inept captain, but a deliberate, meticulously executed murder on a grand scale." I drew in a sharp breath. "Murder at sea, Holmes? Surely the Board of Trade Inquiry will attribute it to the blizzard and navigational error. The Board of Trade, my dear Watson, is admirably equipped to measure the tonnage of iron and calculate the insurance premiums of legitimate commerce, but it is notoriously blind to the delicate machinations of human malice," Holmes said, never taking his eyes from our guest. He inclined his head slightly toward the stranger. "Am I not correct, my dear sir? You were not a passenger listed upon the manifest of the Norfolk, nor were you a member of her crew. You occupied the vacant berth in the private stateroom designated for the government courier who was transporting the Anglo-Egyptian Trade Pact documents which appear to have vanished into the Atlantic foam along with the unfortunate fellow who originally held the commission." The stranger's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched visibly along his cheekbone, and for a fraction of a second his fingers gripped the arms of the leather chair with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "You continue to startle me, Mr. Holmes," the visitor said, his voice dropping an octave, rich with a suppressed intensity that commanded absolute attention. "My name is not upon the manifest because it was never intended to be. I boarded the vessel under a temporary diplomatic pass issued in Alexandria under the authority of the Foreign Office. The man who should have carried the portfolio, a young attaché by the name of Arthur Pendleton, was found dead in his quarters at the Cairo Railway Hotel 48 hours before we weighed anchor. His throat was cut from ear to ear with a surgeon's scalpel, and the dispatch box was emptied." "Good God!" I exclaimed, rising halfway out of my chair. "A diplomatic assassination on foreign soil." "And yet," Holmes murmured, leaning forward with an expression of intense, rapt fascination, "despite the removal of the original courier, the perpetrators of that vile deed discovered, much to their dismay, that the documents had already been duplicated and entrusted to a second unheralded traveler who possessed the foresight to book passage under an alias and travel by an independent route to the port. Am I right in assuming, sir, that you are that second traveler?" The stranger stared at Holmes in absolute silence for several long seconds. The tension in the room grew almost palpable, the air seeming to thicken until it felt difficult to draw a full breath. Then, slowly, a grim, humorless smile broke through the stern lines of the visitor's face, and he reached into the inner pocket of his tweed coat. "You are not merely a detective, Mr. Holmes," the stranger said softly, withdrawing a thick packet of heavy parchment-bound papers, secured with a broad red ribbon and stamped with the heavy wax seal of the British Admiralty. "You are an unmitigated wizard. The dispatch box went down with the ship, exactly as you surmised. But the true papers, the ones that expose the entire international syndicate operating between Cairo, Constantinople, and the docks of London, never left my person." He extended the packet across the small table that separated them. Holmes did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, studying the wax seal with the meticulous attention of a connoisseur examining a disputed canvas. "Before I touch those papers, or listen to another word of your narrative," Holmes said, his voice dropping into that cool, analytical register that brooked no argument, "there is one small matter we must clarify. You entered this room 3 minutes ago. You walked directly to my hearth, and you addressed me by name without hesitation or preamble. Yet you have carefully avoided revealing your own identity, even while laying state secrets upon my hearthrug. Who, sir, are you? And more importantly, who is the man that sent you to 221B Baker Street?" The stranger hesitated. He glanced toward the window, where the grey London fog was slowly thickening into a sulphurous yellow pall as the morning wore on. When he turned his slate-grey eyes back to Holmes, there was an unmistakable shadow of genuine apprehension in their depths. "The man who sent me, Mr. Holmes," the visitor said quietly, "is a man who is currently lying upon a slab in the Westminster mortuary, having been stabbed through the heart with an ivory-handled stiletto less than 2 hours after we scrambled ashore from the rescue cutter at Dover. And the name by which he knew you, the name he whispered to me with his dying breath while the rain beat down upon our cab, was not Sherlock Holmes." Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine expression of surprise I had seen cross his features since the morning began. "Indeed?" Holmes whispered, his voice dangerously low. "And what name did he use?" The stranger leaned forward, lowering his voice until it was barely audible above the crackle of the coal fire. "He called you the architect of the abyss, Mr. Holmes," the visitor replied. "And he told me that if I wished to see the next 24 hours, I must place these documents into your hands before the man with the silver-plated cane catches up with us." Chapter 3: The Cryptic Legacy of Westminster. The phrase "architect of the abyss" seemed to linger in the stagnant air of our study long after the visitor's voice had faded away. It was a title so utterly alien to the quiet, methodical world of Baker Street, and so grandly melodramatic, that for a fleeting instant I wondered if our guest's mind had unhinged under the terrifying strain of the shipwreck. Yet when I looked from his tense, weather-beaten face to Holmes, I saw no trace of amusement or professional condescension upon my companion's features. Holmes remained perfectly still, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his dark eyes glittering with an intensity that betrayed the lightning-fast calculations racing through his brain. The casual, almost playful detachment with which he had greeted the morning had vanished entirely, replaced by that cold, predatory focus which always signaled he had scented a quarry worthy of his supreme intellect. "An evocative moniker," Holmes murmured softly, his tone dangerously quiet as he leaned back against the cushions of the sofa, "and one that carries a distinct continental flavor." The Parisian underworld of the late 70s utilized similar theatrical nomenclature when describing the masterminds behind the boulevard heists. But let us be entirely clear upon one vital point, my dear sir. I am a consulting detective residing at 221B Baker Street, not an architect of abysses, nor a theatrical player in international melodrama. If a dying man chose to invest me with such a grandiose title, it suggests he was either suffering from the terminal delirium of a punctured lung, or attempting to flatter me into taking up a case that ordinary Scotland Yard officials would rightly deem a suicide mission. The stranger shook his head slowly, his slate-grey eyes steady and unyielding. "He was neither delirious nor flattering you, Mr. Holmes." I held his hand as the life ebbed out of him in the dark archway off Victoria Street. "His name was Edward Vance, a former lieutenant in the Royal Engineers seconded to diplomatic intelligence, and he possessed the clearest, coldest mind of any man I have ever encountered. When he whispered that name into my ear, his eyes were wide open, and he gripped my wrist with a force that left bruises. He told me that if the papers regarding the Norfolk fell into any hands other than yours, the entire network of intelligence stretching from Alexandria to Whitehall would be compromised within 48 hours. Holmes finally reached out, his long, sensitive fingers closing upon the thick packet of parchment-bound papers tied with the broad red ribbon. He did not break the Admiralty seal immediately. Instead, he turned the packet over, running his thumb along the heavy wax and inspecting the microscopic fibers of the paper with an air of absolute concentration. "You mentioned a man with a silver-plated cane. Holmes noted, his gaze still fixed upon the document. A picturesque detail, and one sufficiently distinct to separate him from the sea of ordinary London pedestrians. Did poor Vance give you any indication of this person's identity, or where he might be found? He said only that the man had shadowed us from the moment our rescue cutter touched the stone quayside at Dover, the stranger replied, his massive shoulders tensing beneath his coat. We took a hackney carriage toward the club district to find safe lodging, but the traffic was blocked near Parliament Square by a dray carrying timber. While our vehicle was stationary, a tall individual wearing a heavy beaver-skin coat and supporting himself upon an ebony staff with a massive silver-plated handle stepped up to our window. He did not speak a word. He merely raised the cane, tapped twice upon the glass with a sickeningly deliberate rhythm, and smiled. Vance went white as a sheet, dragged me out through the opposite door into the freezing drizzle, and we ran on foot toward Westminster. That was when the blow was struck, a flash of silver steel from a dark alleyway, a choked gasp, and Vance was down. I caught him, dragged him into the shelter of the stone buttress, and heard his final warning before he breathed his last. I listened in horrified fascination, my medical background instinctively picturing the anatomical trajectory of such a wound. A swift, professional thrust delivered with absolute anatomical precision, intended to terminate life without unseemly struggle or noise. "Good Lord," I muttered, pacing a short circle across the Persian rug. "This is no ordinary street robbery or maritime mishap. We are dealing with an assassin operating in the very heart of the capital, with absolute impunity. An assassin who is unquestionably monitoring your movements at this very moment, Watson," Holmes observed dryly, rising to his feet with the packet of papers still clutched in his hand. He walked briskly to the writing desk by the window, laid the documents carefully upon the blotter, and turned back to face our guest. "You have not yet favored us with your own designation, sir. It is customary, even among clandestine couriers and diplomatic agents, to maintain a nominal identity when soliciting the services of a professional." The stranger hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of internal conflict crossing his rugged features. He squared his broad shoulders, as if bracing himself to deliver a confession of some consequence. "My name is Captain Alan Napier," the visitor said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "Late of Her Majesty's 10th Hussars, currently detached for special service under the direct authorization of the War Office. I have spent the past 5 years operating in the Levant and North Africa, mapping trade routes and keeping a watchful eye upon the steady encroachment of foreign financial syndicates that seek to undermine British influence along the Suez Corridor. The documents upon your desk, Mr. Holmes, represent the complete audit of a secret syndicate, a cabal of international speculators who deliberately bribed a signal officer at Port Said to misdirect the Norfolk into a treacherous, uncharted reef during the height of the blizzard, all to ensure that certain incriminating loan agreements resting in the purser's safe would be sent to the bottom of the sea. Holmes crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "A neat hypothesis, Captain Napier. But a financial syndicate operating on an international scale does not usually resort to bloody street assassinations in broad daylight within the shadow of Westminster Abbey, unless the stakes are infinitely higher than mere loan agreements or trade tariffs. What else did the Norfolk carry?" Napier swallowed hard, glancing toward the closed door of our sitting room, before meeting Holmes's gaze once more. "She carried 20 crates of unminted gold bullion destined for the Imperial Treasury in Cairo, insured through a London syndicate managed by a firm called Morvath and Sons." "Ah," Holmes said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his thin lips. "Morvath, now we arrive at the root of the matter. A Hungarian adventurer of considerable intellect and even greater moral flexibility, who established himself in financial circles 3 years ago and has since acquired an alarming portfolio of property near the East India Docks. I have had occasion to cross paths with Mr. Victor Morvath's financial associates before, though never quite under such damp and murderous circumstances." Before I could interject or ask what connection Morvath might have with the mysterious title bestowed upon my companion, a sharp, metallic sound interrupted our conversation. It was the distinct, unmistakable click of the brass latch upon our outer hallway door downstairs, followed immediately by the heavy, measured tread of footsteps climbing the 17 wooden steps that led directly to our landing. They were not the light, hurried steps of Mrs. Hudson carrying a tea tray, nor the hesitant shuffle of an ordinary petitioner. Each footfall was heavy, deliberate, and spaced with chilling regularity, the step of a man who possessed absolute confidence and expected no impediment in his path. Captain Napier sprang to his feet, his hand instinctively plunging into the deep pocket of his cape, his muscles coiling like a coiled spring. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, and my hand flew to the drawer of my writing desk where I kept my service revolver. Holmes, however, did not draw a weapon. He merely walked calmly across the room to the corner near the bookshelf, where his heavy ash-wood walking stick rested against the wainscot. He picked it up, balanced it effortlessly in his right hand, and stood directly beside the closed doorway, his eyes fixed upon the lintel with an expression of cold, eager anticipation. "They move with commendable promptitude," Holmes whispered, his voice carrying a strange, electrifying note of triumph. "Lock the door behind us, Watson. The game is well and truly afoot." Chapter 4. The silver-plated tap upon the lintel. The heavy, measured tread upon the stairs rose with an ominous deliberateness, each footfall striking the uncarpeted wooden boards of the flight outside with the dull, resonant thud of a pile-driver. There was no hesitation in the cadence, no pause to search for the proper brass plate, and no uncertainty regarding the direction of our door. Whoever mounted our 17 steps did so with the absolute, unshakable assurance of a man who owned the entire thoroughfare of Baker Street. Captain Alan Napier stood frozen beside the leather armchair, his powerful frame coiled like a spring, his hand buried deep within the pocket of his Inverness cape where his fingers gripped some hidden iron. His bronzed features had tightened into a mask of cold hostility, and his slate-grey eyes remained riveted upon the panels of the white-painted door, waiting for the inevitable breach. I glanced swiftly toward my writing desk, my hand hovering over the mahogany drawer where my service revolver lay loaded and waiting. Yet before I could make a move to retrieve it, Holmes raised his left hand in a sharp, peremptory gesture, enjoining absolute silence without so much as turning his head from the entrance. "Quiet, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice scarcely louder than the hiss of the coal fire in the grate. He stood poised beside the doorframe, his tall, spare silhouette cutting a sharp line against the wallpaper, balancing his heavy ashwood walking stick lightly in his right palm. A pistol shot within the confines of Baker Street attracts the attention of every idle constable from here to Marylebone within 3 minutes. Let us first discover what manner of visitor honors us before we introduce Lead into the conversation. As if in direct response to his words, the footsteps reached the small landing outside. There was a brief pause, a moment of absolute breathless stillness in which the ticking of the mantelpiece clock sounded like the hammer blows of a distant blacksmith. Then, instead of the heavy, violent impact of a shoulder smashing against the wooden panels, we heard a sound that sent a cold shriek of apprehension straight down my spine. Tap, tap. 2 distinct, measured blows struck the center of our door. They were delivered not with knuckles, but with the hard metallic head of a heavy staff, struck with a chilling rhythmic precision that matched word for word the exact description Captain Napier had given of the encounter outside Parliament Square. For an instant, none of us moved. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly dense, thick with the chemical reek of Holmes's abandoned coal tar experiment, and the heavy scent of damp wool brought in by the winter storm. Without waiting for an invitation, the brass doorknob turned slowly, with a smooth, oiled silence that betrayed an intimate familiarity with 19th-century interior latches. The door swung inward upon its hinges, revealing the narrow, shadowed hallway beyond. Standing upon the threshold was a tall, imposing figure enveloped in an expensive ankle-length beaver-skin coat that gave him the appearance of a great Russian nobleman. Beneath the upturned collar of the coat, a pale aristocratic face was rendered all the more striking by a pair of piercing pale blue eyes that seemed to strip away the very walls of our apartment with a single comprehensive glance. In his right hand, the visitor supported himself upon an ebony walking stick of extraordinary thickness, capped by a heavy gleaming pommel of solid hallmarked silver that caught the amber light of our hearth. He did not step into the room immediately. He simply stood there, a faint sardonic smile playing about the corners of his thin, bloodless lips, while his pale eyes swept from Captain Napier to myself, and finally rested with cool, ironic amusement upon Sherlock Holmes. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," the stranger said, his voice smooth, cultured, and touched with the unmistakable aristocratic cadence of the continent, perhaps Viennese or Budapest nobility, polished by years of high-stakes diplomacy and financial intrigue. "It is a rare privilege to finally stand within the sanctuary of the celebrated Baker Street philosopher. I trust my knock was not too abrupt for your delicate morning concentration." Holmes did not lower his ashwood stick, nor did he invite the intruder to cross the threshold. Instead, a cold, dangerous light kindled in his dark eyes, and a slow, mirthless smile touched his lips. "Your knock, Mr. Morvarth, has precisely the rhythm one might expect from a gentleman who prefers to conduct his financial negotiations at the bottom of the English Channel rather than across a boardroom table," Holmes replied, his tone conversational, razor-sharp, and entirely devoid of fear. "Pray step inside, or close the door behind you. The draught from the staircase is playing havoc with my chemical retorts, and my friend Dr. Watson is naturally sensitive to uninvited draughts." I felt my jaw drop. Morvarth, the very name my companion had mentioned mere minutes before, as the mastermind behind the syndicate operating out of the East India Docks, was now standing in our doorway, holding a silver-capped staff with the casual grace of a lord inspecting an estate. Victor Morvarth, for it was indeed the Hungarian adventurer whose financial tentacles stretched from the banks of the Danube to the shipping offices of the Thames, did not betray the slightest flicker of surprise at being recognized instantly. His sardonic smile merely deepened, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped across the threshold, drawing the heavy beaverskin coat back to reveal a meticulously tailored frock coat of dark Oxford grey, across which spanned a massive gold watch chain set with heavy garnets. "Ah, the legendary deductive omniscience at work once again," Morvarth murmured, casting a cool, critical eye over our cluttered bookshelves, the chemical apparatus, and the tobacco-strewn table. "It is truly astonishing how easily the human mind can be flattered into believing it perceives the invisible, Mr. Holmes, when in reality it is merely reading from a script carefully prepared for its amusement." "A script, you say?" Holmes rejoined, his posture remaining rigid, his weight balanced upon the balls of his feet. "If this be a theatrical performance, your director has chosen a singularly messy prologue. The murder of Lieutenant Edward Vance in a dark Westminster alleyway scarcely falls under the heading of light comedy, Mr. Morvarth. Nor does the deliberate scuttling of a £200,000 government cargo carrier." Morvarth's pale blue eyes flickered momentarily toward Captain Napier, who had instinctively squared his shoulders and lowered his right hand further into the pocket of his cape. A cold, calculating glint crossed the Hungarian's face, though his voice remained unhurried and silken. "Lieutenant Vance was a foolish, romantic young man who allowed his brief military service to cloud his understanding of modern commercial realities," Morvarth remarked smoothly, leaning his weight slightly upon the heavy silver pommel of his ebony staff. "He imagined he was defending the empire, when in truth he was merely attempting to interfere with the natural consolidation of capital along the African trade routes. Empires rise and fall upon the movement of gold and credit, Mr. Holmes, not upon the sentimental attachment to parchment treaties signed by aging diplomats in Cairo." "And the 20 crates of unminted bullion currently resting upon the ocean floor near the Needles?" Holmes asked, his eyes narrowing to dark slits. "Are those likewise merely abstract movements of credit, or do they represent the tangible profits of your maritime insurance fraud?" For the first time, a faint shadow of genuine irritation crossed Morvarth's pale features. He took another slow step into the room, his gaze locking onto the writing desk near the window where the packet of parchment papers tied with the broad red ribbon lay in plain view. "You are an exceedingly clever man, Mr. Holmes, but you have a tiresome habit of looking for villains where there are only businessmen," Morvarth said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a hard metallic edge that brooked no further pleasantries. "Those documents upon your desk belong legally and properly to Morvarth and Sons. They contain information concerning private commercial transactions that are none of Her Majesty's government's concern, and certainly no concern of a consulting detective from Baker Street. I suggest, with all due regard for your formidable reputation, that you hand them over to me this instant and permit Captain Napier and myself to depart in peace." The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Napier shifted his weight upon the Persian rug, his breath coming in short, hot gasps, his hand tightening around the hidden iron in his pocket. I stared from Morvath to Holmes, my heart thumping wildly against my ribs as I realized we were standing upon the precipice of open violence within the very walls of our home. Holmes looked down at the heavy ashwood walking stick in his hand, then raised his dark eyes to meet the icy glare of the Hungarian financier. A slow, thin smile touched his lips, a smile that held none of the warmth of friendship, but all the cold, terrifying certainty of a trap finally sprung upon its prey. "My dear Mr. Morvath," Holmes said softly, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority through the quiet room, "you display a touching faith in the efficacy of your threats, but you suffer from one fatal miscalculation, a miscalculation common to men who believe that because they can purchase the silence of Scotland Yard inspectors and the corruption of dockside officials, they can likewise dictate terms to the inhabitants of 221B Baker Street." Morvath's eyebrows arched slightly, and his fingers tightened upon the silver pommel of his staff. "And what miscalculation might that be, Mr. Holmes?" "Simply this," Holmes replied, his voice rising in volume and ringing with triumphant steel as he pointed his walking stick directly at the financier's chest. "You assumed that when Captain Napier entered this room 10 minutes ago, he was the only man who brought those documents through our door. You failed entirely to consider that while you were tapping your silver cane upon our landing, I had already dispatched a coded telegraph to Inspector Lestrade instructing him to surround the building with 3 files of city police, and that your carriage downstairs is currently being dismantled by men who know the difference between a legitimate financier and a common maritime thief." Morvath went instantly white. His pale blue eyes darted toward the window, then back to Holmes's unyielding face, while his hand slid imperceptibly toward the heavy silver head of his ebony staff. "The game," Holmes whispered, his eyes blazing with the fierce, joyous light of the hunt, "is finished, Mr. Morvath. Stand quite still, or your next journey will not be to the bottom of the Channel, but to the gallows at Newgate." Chapter 5. The inconsistency of the silver pommel. The name of Inspector Lestrade dropped into the tense atmosphere of our sitting room with the casual precision of a seasoned marksman, acted upon Victor Morvath like a physical blow. The absolute composure that had hitherto marked the Hungarian financier's aristocratic bearing fractured instantly. His pale blue eyes darted from Holmes to the window, and his white, bloodless fingers tightened convulsively around the heavy silver pommel of his ebony staff until the knuckles showed like polished ivory beneath the skin. For 3 agonizing heartbeats, the silence in our little parlor was so profound that one might have heard the settling of the coal embers in the grate. Captain Napier stood motionless beside the leather armchair, his jaw set, his gaze locked upon the financier with the unblinking intensity of a veteran soldier waiting for the order to charge. For my own part, I gripped the edge of my writing desk, my breath suspended, half expecting Morvath to draw a hidden weapon and force a desperate, bloody conclusion to the standoff. Yet Morvath was a man whose intellect matched his cold ambition. He did not lunge, nor did he curse. Instead, a slow, grim shadow of understanding crossed his features, and the rigid tension in his broad shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch. A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped his thin lips. "An admirable bluff, Mr. Holmes," Morvath murmured, his voice regaining its smooth, cultural cadence, though a dangerous edge of steel still lingered beneath the surface. "You invoke the name of Scotland Yard with the practiced ease of an actor treading the boards at the Lyceum, yet it lacks a certain practical foundation. Had Inspector Lestrade and 3 files of city police surrounded this building, the sound of their boots upon the outer pavement would have preceded my arrival by at least 2 minutes. Instead, the only sound upon your stairs was the quiet tapping of my own staff." Holmes did not flinch, nor did the triumphant gleam in his dark eyes dim by a single shade. He lowered his ashwood walking stick just an inch, his posture remaining as balanced and alert as a fencer awaiting a thrust. "You are entirely correct regarding the boots upon the pavement, Mr. Morvath," Holmes replied smoothly, his tone laced with a quiet, devastating irony. "A clever man naturally listens for the heavy trudge of constabulary leather, but you forgot one detail that invariably separates the regular police force from the irregular units I employ. My baker's boy, young Billy, wears rubber-soled canvas shoes when he runs his morning errands through the mews. By the time you turned the corner of Baker Street, my telegraph to Scotland Yard had already been dispatched via the pneumatic tube from the post office across the square, and Billy was engaged in sliding the iron securing bolt across the outer alley gate behind your carriage. Morven's eyes narrowed sharply. For the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty passed across his aristocratic face. He glanced toward the window, where the yellow winter fog was pressing heavily against the panes, distorting the dim shapes of the street below. "You are a most singular adversary, Mr. Holmes," Morven said softly, his fingers loosening their death grip upon the silver staff. He did not make a move toward the door, nor did he attempt to snatch the parchment papers from the desk. Instead, he maintained his ground with a cool, dangerous dignity. "You imagine you have secured a complete victory, that the sinking of the Norfolk, the tragedy at Westminster, and the intricate machinery of our financial syndicate are about to be laid bare before a magistrate at Bow Street. But you are chasing shadows upon a wall. The documents upon that desk do not prove what you think they prove. Do they not?" Holmes stepped forward, his tall, spare frame looming over the financier with an air of absolute authority. Without taking his eyes off Morvath, Holmes reached out with his left hand, picked up the thick packet of parchment tied with the broad red ribbon, and untied the knot with a single practiced flick of his fingers. "Let us examine the evidence with that exactitude which you so admire, Mr. Morvath. Within these pages lies the complete ledger of bribes disbursed to the lighthouse keepers at Portland Bill, the correspondence between your London shipping office and the signal station at Port Said, and, most illuminating of all, the signed contract commissioning the tugboat Goliath to tow the disabled steamer off her course during the height of the snow squall." He drew out a single sheet of heavy, watermark-stamped paper and held it up to the amber light of the gas lamp by the desk. "Signed in your own hand, Mr. Morvath," Holmes continued, his voice ringing with quiet triumph. "Dated 4 days prior to the departure of the Norfolk. The purchase of 300 tons of Cardiff steam coal, delivered not to a legitimate warehouse, but to an unlisted hulk moored quietly in a deserted cove near Weymouth. A curious expenditure for a gentleman who deals exclusively in international credit and abstract finance." I stared at the paper in Holmes's hand, a sudden wave of revelation washing over me as the entire structure of the criminal conspiracy snapped into sharp, logical focus. The forged manifest, the assassination of the unfortunate Lieutenant Vance in the dark archway off Victoria Street, the mysterious title bestowed upon my companion by a dying man, all of it fell into place like the tumblers of a massive iron safe yielding to its master key. Yet even as Holmes held up the damning document, I noticed something strange. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown flickered across my companion's brow, a fleeting shadow of hesitation that would have been entirely invisible to any observer less attuned to his moods than myself. Captain Napier noticed it too. His hand remained buried in his pocket, but his posture stiffened further. "What is it, Mr. Holmes?" he asked sharply. "Is something amiss with the ledger?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He lowered the paper, his dark eyes shifting rapidly from the bold, flourishing signature at the bottom of the page to the heavy silver pommel of the ebony staff still resting in Morvath's hand. A strange, intense stillness settled over my companion, the absolute concentrated quiet of a chess master who has just perceived a hidden trap within the opening moves of a seemingly straightforward gambit. "Mr. Morvath," Holmes said softly, his voice dropping into a register so dangerously calm that it made the hairs upon my arms stand on end. "When you entered this room 3 minutes ago, you supported your weight upon that ebony staff with a pronounced lean toward your left side, an affectation entirely consistent with a gentleman of fashion who wishes to project an air of aristocratic nonchalance." Morvath's eyebrows arched in mild, mocking surprise. "Fashion, Mr. Holmes, is a harsh mistress, particularly when one's joints are affected by the damp air of the London docks." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, taking one slow step closer to the financier. "Yet when you tapped upon our door, the sound was sharp, resonant, and produced by a firm, unyielding stroke delivered with the center of the silver pommel. Furthermore, if one examines the silver surface under a strong lens, one observes a series of minute, parallel scratches running vertically from the rim to the crest, scratches identical to those produced by the locking mechanism of a heavy marine chronometer case. Morvath's face did not pale, but his thin lips tightened into a hard white line. He did not speak. "You are not the master architect of this syndicate, Mr. Morvath," Holmes said, his voice ringing with sudden, absolute conviction as he raised his dark eyes to lock directly onto the Hungarian's pale blue gaze. "You are merely the lieutenant, the financial shield sent forward to draw our attention and recover these documents, while the true mastermind executes the final phase of the operation elsewhere." Before Morvath could utter a syllable in response, a sudden, violent crash echoed from the street below our windows. It was the unmistakable sound of shattering glass, followed immediately by the sharp, metallic clang of iron gates being wrenched violently apart, and the distant hoarse shouting of an angry voice cut short by the scream of a terrified horse. I sprang to the window, throwing back the heavy velvet curtain and pressing my face against the frost-cleared glass. Down in Baker Street, the yellow fog was swirling in frantic eddies around a riderless hansom cab whose horse had bolted across the curb, smashing its offside wheel against the stone pillar of our doorway. But it was not the wrecked carriage that caught my breath. It was the sight of a tall, muffled figure in a heavy beaver skin coat, identical in every respect to the one worn by the man standing in our room, tearing at a dead run down the narrow mews toward Marylebone Road, clutching a leather dispatch case beneath his arm, while a second, larger figure pursued him into the grey gloom. "Holmes," I cried out, pointing frantically through the glass. "Look, another of them. He's escaping down the mews." Holmes did not even turn toward the window. With a motion so blindingly swift that it resembled the strike of an adder, his right hand lashed out, sweeping the heavy ashwood walking stick in a short, crisp arc that caught Victor Morvath's ebony staff just beneath the silver pommel. With a sharp crack of splintering wood, the staff snapped cleanly in two, and from the hollow interior of the broken ebony shaft, something heavy, metallic, and wrapped in oiled silk slid smoothly out, tumbling across the worn Persian rug and coming to rest directly at Captain Napier's feet. Chapter 6: The Platinum Cylinder and the Master's Shadow. The sharp concussive crack of splintering ebony echoed through the confines of our sitting room with the startling finality of a pistol shot. As the lower half of Victor Morvath's magnificent walking stick clattered uselessly against the wainscoting, the heavy metallic object, concealed within its hollowed shaft, struck the worn Persian rug with a dull, sickening thud. It rolled precisely 3 revolutions across the faded wool fibers before coming to rest scarcely an inch from the toe of Captain Alan Napier's military boot. For a span of perhaps 5 seconds, time itself seemed to freeze within the walls of 221B Baker Street. The ticking of the carriage clock upon the mantelpiece sounded unnaturally loud, marking the chaotic suspension of breath among the room's occupants. Captain Napier recoiled instinctively, his broad shoulders tensing as if he expected the mysterious bundle to detonate. His slate-grey eyes darted from the dark parcel at his feet to the pale, stricken face of the Hungarian financier. Morvath stood entirely paralyzed, his manicured hands hovering rigidly in the empty air where his formidable staff had rested only a moment before. The supreme aristocratic arrogance that had cloaked the man upon his arrival was instantly shattered, replaced by an expression of profound, uncomprehending horror. His bloodless lips parted, but no sound emerged. The physiological shock had evidently temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords, an affliction I had frequently observed in the medical tents during the Afghan campaign, when men were confronted with an ambush they had entirely failed to anticipate. Only Sherlock Holmes remained perfectly composed. He lowered his ashwood walking stick with the smooth, unhurried grace of a conductor concluding a symphony, his dark eyes ablaze with the fierce, cold light of intellectual triumph. "I would strongly advise against any sudden movements, Captain Napier," Holmes cautioned, his voice cutting through the thick, electrified silence with absolute authority. "The mechanism within that wrapping is likely highly sensitive to kinetic shock. Watson, my dear fellow, your hands are the steadiest in this room. Be so good as to retrieve our visitor's hidden cargo. Handle it with the utmost delicacy, I beg of you." I swallowed the dry knot of apprehension in my throat and stepped forward, my medical training overriding my natural trepidation. I knelt upon the rug, my knees protesting slightly against the damp chill that pervaded the floorboards. The object was tightly swaddled in a square of heavy blackened silk that had been deeply saturated with a viscous lubricating oil, an unmistakable precaution against the biting damp of the London docks. With extreme care, I peeled back the stiff, greasy folds of the fabric. Beneath the silk lay a perfectly machined cylinder, perhaps 8 inches in length and 3 inches in diameter, crafted not from brass or iron, but from solid gleaming platinum. It was an object of astonishing density and weight, covered from end to end with a series of intricately engraved numerical dials that locked tightly together like the scales of a metallic serpent. "Good heavens, Holmes," I breathed, carefully lifting the heavy cylinder into the amber light of the hearth. "It is a combination lockbox of some sort, fashioned with a precision that defies ordinary metallurgy. It must weigh upwards of 10 pounds, 12.5 pounds to be exact, Watson," Holmes corrected smoothly, stepping closer to examine the object without touching it. "A formidable weight to conceal within the shaft of a walking stick, which brings us to the crux of my deduction. When Mr. Morvath crossed our threshold, the center of gravity in his staff was fundamentally altered. A solid ebony cane pivots near the upper third of its length. Mr. Morvath's cane swung with the pendulous, ungainly momentum of a medieval mace. He attempted to disguise this by leaning heavily upon the silver pommel, feigning a rheumatic affliction. But the human musculature cannot easily counterfeit the strain of supporting 12 pounds of solid platinum suspended at an unnatural angle. The tension in his right deltoid and the slight compensatory drag of his left heel betrayed him entirely. Morvath finally found his voice. It was no longer the smooth, cultured baritone of a confident financial predator, but a ragged, breathless rasp. This is impossible," the Hungarian stammered, his pale blue eyes locked in terrified fascination upon the platinum cylinder resting in my palms. I was assured. I was given absolute guarantees that the staff contained nothing more than the duplicate cryptographic keys to the Suez accounts. I was to carry them for safekeeping while the primary documents were negotiated. Holmes barked a short, humorless laugh, his eyes flashing with sudden predatory intensity. "You were not sent here to negotiate, Mr. Morvath. You were sent here to act as a tethered goat, bleating loudly in the clearing to draw the tiger's attention while the true hunter circled through the tall grass." The color drained entirely from Morvath's face, leaving his complexion the shade of old parchment. He staggered backward, collapsing into the very leather armchair he had previously disdained, his hands trembling violently as they gripped the armrests. "You begin to see the shape of the web in which you are entangled," Holmes continued, his voice dropping into a relentless analytical cadence that hammered at the financier's crumbling defenses. "Did you truly believe that a man who orchestrates the scuttling of a £200,000 government cargo would entrust the core of his operation to a lieutenant with such a highly visible profile in the city? The scratches upon the silver pommel of your cane were not inflicted by ordinary wear. They were the unmistakable marks of a heavy industrial vice. Someone unscrewed the head of your staff, hollowed out the interior, and inserted this platinum puzzle box without your knowledge, sealing it shut before handing it back to you. You were entirely expendable, Mr. Morvath, a sacrificial pawn thrust onto the board to keep me occupied." "Occupied while he escaped," Captain Napier growled, his hand finally emerging from his pocket to reveal the dull steel barrel of a heavy Webley revolver. "The man in the street. Dr. Watson saw him." "Indeed, Watson. What precisely did you observe through the frost before I shattered the cane?" Holmes asked, spinning toward me with a sudden erratic burst of physical energy. The calm, detached philosopher was gone, replaced by the frenetic, vibrating hound who had finally caught the scent of his true quarry. I placed the heavy platinum cylinder carefully upon the writing desk beside the forged Admiralty documents and turned toward my companion. It was a scene of utter chaos, Holmes. A hansom cab had deliberately crashed into the stone pillar of our entrance. The horse was terrified, plunging and kicking in the traces, effectively blocking the entire width of the street. And fleeing down the mews toward Marylebone Road was a man wrapped in a beaver-skin coat, identical to the one worn by Morvath. He was carrying a heavy leather dispatch case beneath his arm, moving with extraordinary speed. "A diversion," Holmes muttered, his long fingers drumming a frantic staccato rhythm against his chin. He began to pace rapidly back and forth across the small clearing of the Persian rug, his movements sharp and disjointed. A brilliant, ruthless diversion. The crash of the cab was calculated to draw our eyes to the window, providing Morvarth with the split second required to draw his hidden weapon or seize the papers from the desk. But the architect of the abyss, if we must use the murdered lieutenant's theatrical nomenclature, underestimated the speed of my own physical reflexes. He assumed the disruption would end in a stalemate, leaving us guarding a decoy while he vanished into the labyrinth of London with the true prize. "But what is the true prize, Mr. Holmes?" Napier demanded, his voice thick with frustration and barely suppressed rage as he kept his revolver trained upon the trembling Hungarian. "If this platinum cylinder was merely a weight to deceive Morvarth, and the papers upon your desk are forgeries, where are the authentic documents that condemn the syndicate?" "They are in the leather dispatch case currently hurrying toward Marylebone Road," Holmes declared, coming to an abrupt halt and fixing me with a piercing glare. "The man in the duplicate coat is the true mastermind. He used Morvarth's identical silhouette to confuse any pursuit, knowing that if the police arrived, they would arrest the man in the beaverskin coat within my rooms and look no further. It is a masterpiece of misdirection, utilizing human greed and vanity as its primary mechanisms." Holmes whirled toward the window, dragging the heavy velvet curtain aside and pressing his face against the freezing glass. The thick, sulphurous yellow fog had rolled deeper into Baker Street, swallowing the street lamps in a murky, impenetrable gloom. The wrecked hansom cab was barely visible as a dark, angular shadow against the swirling mist. "The trail grows colder with every passing second," Holmes muttered, his breath leaving a circle of condensation upon the pane. "The frost upon the cobblestones will hold his footprints for a short time, provided the foot traffic remains sparse. But if he reaches the bustling thoroughfare of Edgware Road, he will melt into the populace like a ghost into a graveyard." He turned back to the room, his dark eyes snapping with urgent electric commands. "Captain Napier," Holmes barked, his voice cracking like a cavalry whip. "You will remain precisely where you are. You have your revolver, and you have a prisoner who has suddenly discovered that his life depends entirely upon our protection. The syndicate will inevitably attempt to silence him before he can testify at the Old Bailey. Bar the outer door, draw the blinds, and do not permit Mr. Morvarth to leave this chair until Inspector Lestrade arrives in person. I have indeed summoned the yard, though they are likely delayed by the iced roads." "You are leaving me behind," Napier protested, his rugged, weathered face flushing with indignation. "The man who ordered the assassination of my comrade is out there. It is my duty to run him to earth." "Your duty, Captain, is to secure the primary witness against the international syndicate," Holmes countered with uncompromising severity. "If Morvarth perishes, the architect of the abyss wins an absolute victory, regardless of whether we recover the dispatch case. You are a soldier, Napier. I expect you to hold this position with the same tenacity you would exhibit upon the frontiers of the Empire." Before the burly captain could formulate a rebuttal, Holmes was already moving. He threw off his claret-colored dressing gown, tossing it carelessly over the back of the sofa, and shrugged himself into his heavy, caped ulster. He snatched his deerstalker cap from the peg behind the door and turned to me, his eyes blazing with that familiar, infectious fire that had drawn me into so many dark and dangerous adventures. "Come, Watson, the game has shifted from the chessboard to the alleyway, and we must not lose the scent," Holmes cried, wrenching open the door to the sitting room. "Bring your revolver and button your coat to the chin. The frost is bitter, but the man we are hunting possesses a heart far colder than any London winter." I did not hesitate. I shoved the platinum cylinder to the very back of the desk drawer, snatched up my heavy woolen overcoat, and checked the chamber of my service revolver with practiced efficiency. As I hurried out onto the landing, I cast one final glance back into the sitting room. Captain Napier stood like a statue of vengeance, his weapon leveled squarely at Victor Morvarth, who sat huddled in the leather armchair, staring blankly into the dying embers of the fire as the full, terrifying reality of his betrayal washed over him. Holmes was already halfway down the 17 steps, his long legs taking the stairs 2 at a time. I scrambled after him, the cold draft from the lower hall striking my face like a physical blow. When we reached the front door, We found the heavy iron hinges, slightly warped from the impact of the carriage outside, but Holmes wrenched it open with a violent surge of strength. We plunged out into the freezing yellow gloom of Baker Street. The air was harsh and metallic, tasting of coal smoke and frozen damp. The wrecked hansom cab lay abandoned against our steps, the horse having snapped its traces and fled. Holmes did not spare the wreckage a second glance. He immediately dropped to one knee upon the frosted pavement, his sharp eyes scanning the thin layer of rime ice that coated the cobblestones near the entrance to the mews. "Here, Watson," Holmes whispered fiercely, pointing a long gloved finger at a series of faint, widely spaced impressions in the frost. The stride is long and hurried. The right heel strikes heavier than the left, a man carrying a significant weight beneath his right arm. The architect of the abyss believes he has outsmarted the residents of Baker Street. Let us show him the error of his calculations. Without another word, Holmes rose and darted into the swirling fog, moving with the silent, relentless speed of a hunting hound. I tightened my grip upon my revolver and plunged into the mist behind him, the freezing London air burning my lungs as the true pursuit finally began. Chapter 7. The Phantom in the Fog. The yellow fog of London, when combined with a bitter November frost, assumes the character of a living, malevolent entity. It is not merely a suspension of moisture and coal smoke, but a suffocating sulphurous miasma that blinds the eyes, sears the lungs, and distorts the familiar geometry of the metropolis into a nightmare of shifting shadows and echoing phantoms. As Holmes and I plunged headlong into the narrow mews behind Baker Street, this freezing shroud closed around us instantly, swallowing the shattered hansom cab and the warmth of our lodgings in a single breathless gulp. Holmes moved with the frantic, predatory energy of a bloodhound that has just caught the scent of the fox. He did not run upright, but rather scuttled forward in a low, crouching gait, his deerstalker cap pulled tightly down over his brow, his sharp eyes fixed relentlessly upon the thin, glittering crust of rime ice that coated the cobblestones. In his right hand he clutched a heavy, lead-weighted hunting crop he had snatched from the umbrella stand during our exit, while his left hand continuously brushed the damp brickwork of the alley to maintain his bearing in the blinding gloom. "Keep close, Watson," Holmes called back over his shoulder, his voice muffled and flattened by the oppressive density of the fog. "The frost is our only ally in this desolate wilderness. The man we are pursuing carries a significant weight, the leather dispatch case you observed from the window, and his stride is artificially lengthened by the urgency of his flight. He is striking the pavement heavily with his right heel. Look here, and here." I hurried after him, my right hand gripping the cold, checkered butt of my service revolver within the deep pocket of my woolen overcoat. I squinted through the swirling yellow vapors, and sure enough, I could discern the faint, dark impressions left by a heavy, square-toed boot in the delicate white frost. The tracks were widely spaced, indicating a desperate tearing run, and they led unerringly down the crooked spine of the mews toward the distant, muffled rumble of Marylebone Road. "He cannot maintain this pace for long," I panted, my breath pluming like dragon's smoke in the freezing air. "The man is wearing a heavy beaver-skin coat, identical to Morvath's. The sheer weight of the garment, combined with the dispatch case, will swiftly exhaust him. Do not underestimate the stamina of a man who plays for such colossal stakes, Watson," Holmes threw back, not slackening his pace by a fraction. "The architect of the abyss is no common street pad snatching a purse. He is a master of logistics. He will have calculated his escape route with the same ruthless precision he applied to the sinking of the Norfolk. He knows that if he can reach the bustling thoroughfares, the multitude of pedestrians and the slush of the carriage wheels will obliterate his tracks completely. We have perhaps 3 minutes before he vanishes into the impenetrable labyrinth of the city." We burst out of the narrow confines of the mews and onto the broader pavement of a cross street. Here the fog was even thicker, rolling in sluggish, dirty yellow waves from the direction of the Thames. The sputtering gas lamps that lined the thoroughfare cast sickly, isolated halos of light that penetrated no more than a few feet into the gloom. A heavy dray wagon clattered past us, its driver entirely invisible, the enormous draft horses appearing as spectral beasts materializing from the void and vanishing just as quickly. Holmes threw himself onto the pavement, completely disregarding the damp and the cold, his face inches from the stone. For several agonizing seconds, he remained entirely motionless, a dark silhouette against the grey frost. Then, with a sharp cry of triumph, he sprang back to his feet. "He has crossed the road," Holmes cried, pointing his hunting crop toward the opposite pavement. "The tracks are fainter here, obscured by the passage of a milk cart, but the heavy right heel strike is unmistakable. He has eschewed the main road and turned down the narrow passage of St. Vincent Street. A tactical error, Watson. He seeks the obscurity of the alleys, but in doing so he isolates himself from the very crowds that could provide his salvation." We dashed across the frozen mud of the street, slipping and sliding upon the treacherous surface, and threw ourselves into the gaping black mouth of St. Vincent Street. This was a grim, dilapidated corridor, flanked by towering, soot-stained brick walls and windowless warehouses. The fog hung trapped between the buildings like stagnant water in a canal, so dense that I could scarcely see my companion's back, though he was no more than 2 paces ahead of me. The silence here was absolute, profound, and profoundly unnerving. The distant rumble of London traffic was entirely extinguished, leaving only the harsh, rhythmic rasp of our own breathing and the sharp clack-clack of our boots upon the paving stones. Suddenly Holmes threw out his arm, striking me squarely in the chest and bringing me to an abrupt, staggering halt. He stood entirely rigid, his head cocked to one side, his entire being focused into an instrument of pure auditory perception. "Listen," he whispered, the single word cutting through the freezing air like a scalpel. I strained my ears against the muffling blanket of the fog. At first I heard nothing but the pounding of my own blood in my temples. But then, from somewhere in the impenetrable gloom ahead, it came, a rapid, heavy, irregular splashing sound, as of heavy boots running through the shallow, semi-frozen puddles that gathered in the depressions of the alleyway. "We have him," Holmes breathed, a terrible cold joy illuminating his sharp features. "He is slowing down, the weight is telling upon him. Draw your revolver, Watson, and for God's sake mind your footing. A cornered beast is infinitely more dangerous than a fleeing one." We crept forward with infinite caution, abandoning the reckless sprint for a silent, measured stalk. The alley twisted sharply to the left, narrowing into a foul, refuse-strewn passage that smelled strongly of rotting cabbage and stale beer. As we rounded the blind corner, the fog parted momentarily, caught by a sudden freezing updraft from the river. There, not 30 yards ahead of us, perfectly illuminated beneath the sputtering glare of a solitary wall-mounted gas lamp, was our quarry. It was the tall, imposing figure enveloped in the magnificent ankle-length beaver-skin coat. The high collar was turned up, concealing the back of the man's head, and beneath his right arm, tightly clutched against his ribs, was the heavy, brass-bound leather dispatch case I had seen from the window of Baker Street. He was leaning heavily against the damp brick wall, his chest heaving violently, his posture speaking of utter, absolute physical exhaustion. He had run himself into the ground. "Stand precisely where you are." Holmes's voice rang out with the shattering authority of a military command, echoing off the brick walls like a physical blow. "The alley is blocked, and my colleague has his weapon drawn and leveled at your spine. Turn around slowly and keep your hands entirely visible." The figure stiffened. For a long, terrifying moment, he did not move. I raised my revolver, sighting down the dull steel barrel, my finger resting lightly upon the trigger. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, sickening rhythm. The architect of the great conspiracy, the mastermind who had ordered the brutal assassination of Lieutenant Vance and the drowning of the Norfolk's crew, was finally at our mercy. Slowly, agonizingly, the man in the beaver-skin coat turned to face us. He did not possess the pale, aristocratic, mocking features of Victor Morvath. He did not possess the cold, calculating intelligence of an international financial predator. Instead, staring back at us from beneath the brim of a battered, greasy cloth cap, was the terrified, hollow-cheeked, unwashed face of a common London vagrant. His eyes were wide with blind panic, his jaw trembling violently, revealing a mouthful of broken and missing teeth. The magnificent beaver-skin coat hung awkwardly upon his emaciated frame, entirely out of proportion to his narrow shoulders. "Don't shoot, Governor. For pity's sake, don't shoot." The miserable creature wailed, dropping the heavy leather dispatch case onto the cobblestones and throwing his grime-encrusted hands high into the air. "I ain't done nothing. I swear on my mother's grave, I ain't done a single thing." Holmes stopped dead in his tracks. The triumphant fire that had blazed in his eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by a look of such profound, unadulterated horror that it struck me harder than a physical blow. He did not lower his hunting crop, but his arm fell to his side as if the muscles had suddenly been severed. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "Where did you get that coat? Speak, man, if you value your miserable life." "I don't know him, governor, I swear it," the vagrant babbled, his knees knocking together in his terror. "I was just sleeping under the arches near Marylebone, minding my own business, when this toff comes up to me out of the fog. A tall bloke he was, wearing this very coat. He pulls it off, throws it at me, and shoves this leather bag into my hands. He presses a whole golden sovereign into my palm, a whole sovereign, governor, and tells me to run down this alley as fast as my legs could carry me, and to make as much noise as possible doing it." "The dispatch case," Holmes snapped, lunging forward with a sudden, terrifying ferocity. He seized the heavy leather bag from the cobblestones, tore at the brass buckles, and wrenched the flap open. He plunged his hand inside and pulled out the contents, casting them savagely onto the wet pavement. It was not a collection of damning financial ledgers, nor cryptographic keys, nor state secrets. It was a pair of standard clay building bricks, wrapped in a bundle of 2-day-old copies of the Daily Telegraph to prevent them from rattling. "Good God, Holmes," I whispered, lowering my revolver as the sheer, unadulterated brilliance of the deception washed over me. It was a double blind, the crashed carriage, the man fleeing down the mews in the identical coat. It was all an elaborate pantomime constructed solely for our benefit. "A pantomime, Watson?" Holmes hissed, his face contorted into a mask of bitter, agonizing realization. He spun around, staring back down the dark, fog-choked alleyway toward the distant, invisible bulk of Baker Street. "It was not a pantomime, it was a snare. A perfectly executed, meticulously timed snare, and we, the great detectives, the infallible observers, have walked into it with the blind, unquestioning obedience of sheep led to the slaughter." "I do not understand," I said, my mind struggling to keep pace with his rapid, terrifying deductions. "If the man who fled was merely a hired decoy, where is the true architect of the abyss? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to lure us away from our own lodgings?" Holmes seized me by the lapels of my overcoat, his dark eyes burning with a desperate, frantic urgency. "Do you not see it, Watson? The mastermind was never the man in the street. The mastermind was never fleeing from us. The man who crashed the carriage and handed over this coat was merely another lieutenant, another expendable pawn placed on the board to draw the hounds away from the meat." He released me and struck his own forehead with the heel of his hand, a gesture of profound, uncharacteristic self-reproach. Morva was the first decoy, sent inside to focus our attention. The man in the street was the second decoy, sent to draw our physical pursuit. The architect of the abyss played upon my vanity, Watson. He knew I would shatter Morvath's cane. He knew I would discover the heavy platinum cylinder hidden within it. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that my predatory instincts would compel me to abandon the cylinder in the safety of my rooms, to pursue the fleeing shadow in the fog. "But the platinum cylinder is safe," I protested. "I placed it myself in the bottom drawer of your writing desk before we left, and Captain Napier is standing guard over Morvath with a loaded revolver. Even if the mastermind intends to circle back and steal it, he cannot possibly overcome an armed military man." "You fool, Watson." "We are both fools," Holmes roared, his voice tearing through the silence of the alleyway like a gunshot. "Napier is not guarding the prisoner. Napier is the architect of the abyss." The words struck me like a physical blow to the stomach. The solid pavement seemed to sway beneath my feet. "Napier? But he brought us the documents. He was hunted by Morvath. He watched his own comrade die in the street." "Lies, Watson. A tapestry of brilliant, interlocking lies," Holmes shouted, already turning and sprinting back down the alleyway with a desperate, terrifying speed. "He orchestrated the entire charade. He allowed Morvath to track him to our door so he could play the victim. He fed us the story of the murdered lieutenant to gain our trust. The platinum cylinder was the true prize all along. the very object he needed to recover from Morvath without arousing the Hungarian's suspicions or my own. He used us to disarm Morvath, used us to extract the cylinder from the cane, and then used the decoy in the street to clear the room so he could eliminate Morvath and take the prize without interference. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the horrifying logic of Holmes's deduction locking into place with devastating clarity. Then, with a cry of alarm, I threw myself down the alleyway in pursuit of my companion. "Holmes, wait!" I shouted into the suffocating yellow gloom. "If Napier is the mastermind, and he is armed, run, Watson, for the love of God, run!" Holmes's voice drifted back to me, thin and desperate in the freezing mist. "If we do not reach Baker Street within the next 2 minutes, Victor Morvath is a dead man, and the greatest criminal intellect in Europe will vanish into the fog with a weapon capable of shattering the empire." We tore through the streets of London, no longer hunters, but desperate, terrified men racing against the ticking clock of a master assassin's timetable. The fog whipped at our faces, blinding us, choking us, as we threw ourselves toward the inevitable, bloody climax that waited for us within the walls of our own home. Chapter 8. The Echo of the Empty Drawer. We ran blindly through the suffocating labyrinth of the London streets, two desperate phantoms swallowed entirely by the dense yellow miasma of the November fog. I have experienced the chaotic terror of a battlefield charge across the sun-baked plains of Afghanistan, with the whistle of Jezzail bullets slicing through the air and the earth trembling beneath the hooves of cavalry. Yet I can attest with absolute certainty that no military engagement ever struck such a profound icy chord of panic within my breast as that frantic, stumbling sprint back toward Baker Street. Holmes was a revelation of terrifying physical endurance. He tore through the freezing gloom with the singular, unyielding momentum of a projectile, his heavy ulster flapping wildly behind him like the wings of some great, dark bird. He did not speak, nor did he look back to ensure I was following. His entire being was consumed by the bitter, agonizing realization that his own supreme intellect, the very instrument upon which he had built his unparalleled reputation, had been masterfully weaponized against him. My own lungs burned as though I were inhaling sulphurous fire, and my boots slipped treacherously upon the rime ice that coated the cobblestones, but I dared not slow my pace. The brilliant, monstrous architecture of Captain Alan Napier's deception played over and over in my mind, a kaleidoscopic nightmare of interlocking falsehoods. He had walked into our sanctuary, wrapped himself in the noble cloak of a betrayed patriot, and manipulated every variable with the cold, frictionless precision of a mathematical equation. He had used Victor Morvath's towering arrogance, my own predictable physical observations, and Holmes's insatiable predatory instincts to clear the board entirely, leaving himself alone with the ultimate prize. We burst onto the broader thoroughfare of Marylebone Road, dodging blindly between the shadowy bulks of stalled drays and the terrified whinnies of invisible horses, before finally hurling ourselves around the corner into the familiar environs of Baker Street. The wrecked hansom cab still lay aggressively angled against the curb, its smashed-off side wheel a silent testament to the meticulously orchestrated diversion. The heavy wooden outer door of 221B, which Holmes had pulled shut with such violent force upon our exit, now hung ajar, shifting lazily upon its warped iron hinges with a dismal groaning creak that sounded entirely too much like a graveyard gate. "Mrs. Hudson," I roared, my voice tearing raw from my throat as I plunged into the darkened lower hallway, my service revolver raised and ready. "Mrs. Hudson, answer me." "Do not shout, Watson," Holmes hissed, grasping my shoulder with a grip that bruised the flesh beneath my heavy overcoat. His voice was ragged, stripped of all its usual calm detachment. If she were in a position to answer, she would have met us upon the step. Pray God the woman had the good sense to remain in the basement kitchens when the violence began. It is not the ground floor that concerns us. Look upward. I followed the trajectory of his pointing finger. The narrow, uncarpeted staircase leading up to our first-floor apartments was draped in heavy, sepulchral shadow, but a faint amber glow spilled from the slightly open door of our sitting room, and drifting down those 17 wooden steps, cutting sharply through the ubiquitous odor of London coal smoke and winter damp, was the unmistakable, copper-heavy stench of freshly spilled arterial blood. Holmes did not wait for my medical assessment of the scent. He bounded up the stairs 3 at a time, moving with an eerie, terrifying silence, his lead-weighted hunting crop raised like a mace. I followed close upon his heels, the hammer of my Webley drawn back, every nerve in my body screaming in anticipation of a sudden ambush from the landing. We reached the threshold of our sitting room, and Holmes kicked the door inward with a violent thrust of his boot. It swung wide, crashing against the interior wallpaper, revealing the shattered remnants of our sanctuary. The room had not been merely disturbed. It had been the site of a brief, desperate, and utterly savage struggle. The heavy leather armchair had been overturned, its brass casters gleaming dully in the firelight. The small table that usually held Holmes's tobacco pouch and my medical journals was splintered in two, scattering papers and shattered glass across the faded Persian rug. But it was the center of the room that commanded our absolute, horrifying attention. Victor Morvath lay sprawled upon his back near the hearth, his magnificent Oxford grey frock coat hopelessly soaked in a dark, spreading crimson stain. The aristocratic arrogance that had characterized the Hungarian financier was entirely extinguished, replaced by a grotesque mask of shock and agony. His pale blue eyes were fixed blindly upon the plaster ceiling, wide and unblinking, reflecting the dying embers of the fire. I holstered my revolver instantly and dropped to my knees beside the fallen man, my medical training overriding my horror. I tore open his ruined waistcoat, searching frantically for a pulse, but the skin was already cooling beneath my fingers. "It is too late, Holmes," I whispered, sitting back upon my heels, a cold knot of dread settling heavily in my stomach. "He is gone. Death must have been instantaneous, or very nearly so." Holmes stood perfectly still in the center of the devastated room, his dark eyes sweeping over the carnage with the clinical, merciless detachment of a coroner. The frantic energy that had propelled him through the streets had vanished entirely, replaced by an absolute freezing stillness that was infinitely more intimidating. "The weapon, Watson?" he demanded softly, his voice devoid of all inflection. "A blade," I replied, forcing myself to examine the grievous wound with professional objectivity. A single devastating upward thrust beneath the floating ribs on the left side, angling directly into the myocardium. It is a wound delivered with terrifying anatomical precision, designed to bypass the skeletal structure entirely and sever the heart without striking bone. It requires not only immense physical strength, but the specialized training of a soldier accustomed to close-quarters assassination. The blade was twisted upon extraction to ensure massive internal hemorrhaging. He did not even have the breath to cry out. Precisely the same methodology employed to silence the unfortunate lieutenant in the archway off Victoria Street, Holmes murmured, his eyes tracking a series of bloody, smeared footprints that led away from the corpse. "Napier is a creature of grim habit, it seems. He utilized the identical technique, likely with the identical weapon, a heavy military-issue trench knife, if the width of the entry wound is any indication." "But Napier had a revolver," I protested, rising to my feet and gesturing toward the spot where the supposed captain had been standing. "When we left this room, he had a loaded Webley trained squarely upon Morvath's chest. Why risk a physical struggle? Why not simply shoot him?" Holmes' lip curled into a bitter, self-derisive sneer. "Because a gunshot within these walls would have summoned the very police force I had threatened Morvath with, Watson. Napier is a master of silent, brutal efficiency. He could not afford the noise of a discharged firearm. He waited until our footsteps faded upon the stairs. Then he holstered his weapon, crossed the room, and executed the Hungarian with the cold blood of a slaughterhouse butcher. And then Holmes pivoted sharply, his gaze locking onto my writing desk by the window. The heavy mahogany bottom drawer, where I had so carefully sequestered the heavy platinum cylinder just 15 minutes prior, was entirely destroyed. Napier had not bothered to search for a key. He had simply utilized the shattered bottom half of Morvath's ebony walking stick as a lever, jamming the solid wood into the brass lock and wrenching it downward with brute force until the thick mahogany facing splintered into jagged shards. The drawer gaped open, utterly empty. The 12.5-pound platinum puzzle box, the true prize of this labyrinthine conspiracy, was gone. "He has it," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He played us for absolute fools, committed murder in our own sitting room, and walked out with the very object we swore to protect. The man is a demon, Holmes. He is not a demon, Watson. He is merely a man of extraordinary intellect, entirely unshackled by the constraints of human morality, Holmes replied, stepping over the ruined furniture to examine the shattered desk. But even the most meticulous architect must leave dust upon the floorboards when he constructs his labyrinth. Let us see what errors our Captain Napier committed in his haste to secure his prize. Holmes dropped to his hands and knees, producing his small silver-rimmed magnifying glass from the deep pocket of his ulster. He began to crawl slowly across the perimeter of the room, his nose practically brushing the worn fibers of the Persian rug, his entire being focused upon the microscopic debris left in the wake of the violence. For 10 long minutes, the only sound in the room was the harsh, rhythmic rasp of his breathing and the occasional snap of a settling coal in the grate. I stood silently by the door, keeping a watchful eye upon the dark staircase, though I knew in my heart that the bird had long since flown the cage. Finally, Holmes reached the area immediately beneath the shattered desk drawer. He paused, his head cocked to one side like a listening terrier. With infinite care, he reached out his long, sensitive fingers and extracted something infinitesimally small from the frayed edge of the rug. He held it up to the light of the gas lamp, his eyes narrowing into dark, impenetrable slits. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, stepping forward eagerly. "Have you found a clue? A button torn in the struggle? A trace of mud from his boots?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He stared at the minuscule object between his thumb and forefinger for a long, agonizing moment, a strange, utterly unreadable expression settling over his sharp features. The bitter fury of defeat seemed to melt away, replaced by the cold, terrifying dawn of a new and vastly more dangerous calculation. With a swift, deliberate motion, Holmes slipped the object into his waistcoat pocket, deliberately concealing it from my view. "It is nothing, my dear Watson," Holmes said smoothly, rising to his feet and brushing the dust from the knees of his trousers. "Merely a stray flake of tobacco ash, entirely unrelated to our present catastrophe." I stared at him, utterly bewildered by his sudden shift in demeanor. "Tobacco ash? Holmes, the man has just committed murder in our home and absconded with a mechanism of immense geopolitical importance. And you are dismissing a clue at the scene of the crime? What did you find?" "I told you, Watson, it is of no consequence," Holmes replied, his tone adopting that cool, impenetrable register that warned me he had closed the vault of his mind and locked it tight. "What is of consequence is the trajectory of our adversary. Napier has secured the platinum cylinder, but he cannot open it. The combination dials upon the casing are infinitely complex, and attempting to force the mechanism with brute strength will undoubtedly destroy the contents. He requires the cryptographic keys to align the dials, and those keys, according to Morvas's final, terrified confession, were the only things the Hungarian truly possessed. Then Napier must seek out the rest of the syndicate, I reasoned, struggling to follow the rapid leaps of his intellect. He must find the remaining members of the conspiracy to unlock the box. "Precisely," Holmes said, a grim, humorless smile finally touching his thin lips. "He has won the opening gambit, Watson, but he has left the board in disarray. He believes he has blinded us, but in his supreme arrogance he has inadvertently illuminated the very path he must take to conclude his vile enterprise. Come, my friend, we must summon Inspector Lestrade to manage this grisly tableau, and then we must make preparations." "Preparations for what?" I asked, a fresh wave of apprehension washing over me. Holmes walked to the window and stared out into the dense yellow fog that had swallowed the architect of our humiliation. "Preparations to descend into the abyss, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrible, dark resolve. "Captain Napier believes he is the sole master of this deadly game. It is time we proved him fatally mistaken." Chapter 9. The Anatomy of a Calculated Error. The heavy tramp of official boots upon the stairs outside signaled the arrival of Inspector Lestrade and his retinue of city police. For the next hour, the cluttered sanctuary of 221B Baker Street was transformed into a grim theatre of inquiry. The Scotland Yard contingent moved with solemn efficiency, recording the dimensions of the room, sketching the precise angle of Victor Morvath's mortal wound, and arranging for the removal of the Hungarian financier's remains to the parish mortuary. Lestrade, his face drawn into deep, worried lines beneath his constable's cap, hovered near the mantelpiece, casting uneasy glances at my companion. "I tell you, Mr. Holmes, this business grows darker by the hour," Lestrade muttered, tapping his notebook against his palm with nervous frequency. "First, the steamship Norfolk goes down in a blinding snow squall off the Needles with £200,000 in government securities. Then a former royal engineer is found butchered in a Westminster alleyway, and now a foreign financier of international repute is murdered inside your own sitting room while we are scouring the Mews for a fleeing phantom. The Home Office is clamoring for answers, and the Commissioner is breathing down my neck. Who is this Captain Napier, and where in God's name has he vanished to?" "Captain Napier has vanished, my dear Lestrade, into the very element from which he emerged, the impenetrable yellow fog of a corrupt metropolis," Holmes replied smoothly, standing beside the shattered writing desk with his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his trousers. His outward composure was absolute, betraying none of the furious internal machinery that I knew was driving his restless intellect. He possesses the intelligence of a general and the ruthlessness of an executioner, but he possesses one fatal flaw common to all men of extraordinary arrogance. He believes he is the only chess player capable of thinking 12 moves ahead. "A chess player?" Lestrade blinked, bewildered. "The man is a common cutthroat and a maritime thief. What do we care for chess when we have a corpse upon the hearthrug?" "The corpse, Lestrade, is merely a captured rook," Holmes said quietly, his eyes fixing upon the inspector with an intensity that made the older man take an involuntary half-step back. "A pawn sacrificed to secure a vital square. Do not trouble yourself with theoretical discussions just yet. Ensure that the yard places a discreet, round-the-clock watch upon the docks near Blackfriars and the passenger manifests leaving for Ostend, but do not attempt to apprehend Napier should you encounter him. To corner a tiger without a cage is merely to invite unnecessary slaughter. Leave the final maneuver to Baker Street." Lestrade opened his mouth as if to lodge a vehement protest, but one look at the cold, unyielding fire in Holmes's dark eyes checked his tongue. With a heavy sigh and a muttered oath about eccentric consulting detectives, the inspector turned away to supervise the transport of the body, leaving us alone amidst the splintered furniture and the drifting reek of powder smoke. As the heavy outer door closed behind the last of the constables, the silence of the room descended upon us like a physical weight. I turned to Holmes, my nerves strung to a razor's edge, my medical mind still reeling from the violence of the morning. "Holmes," I began, stepping across the ruined Persian rug, "you are concealing something. When you examined the floorboards beneath the desk after Morvas's murder, you found an object. You slipped it into your waistcoat pocket and lied to me about it being mere tobacco ash. If Napier has the platinum cylinder and the syndicate is scattered, how on earth do we propose to track him?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked slowly to the window, staring out into the grey, desolate afternoon where the gas lamps were once again beginning to flicker against the gathering gloom. For a long, motionless moment, he stood like a statue carved from winter stone. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into the deep pocket of his waistcoat and withdrew a tiny, glittering object, placing it carefully upon the unblemished corner of the mantelpiece. I stepped forward and peered down at it. It was a minute, exquisitely machined screw of polished brass, no larger than the head of a common pin, with an extraordinarily fine, non-standard thread pitch. Clinging to its microscopic grooves was a tiny speck of grayish, fibrous material that looked under the dim light to be a fragment of wool-felt insulation. "Observe it closely, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice dropping into that rich, confidential register that always signaled he was about to unpack the crowning deduction of a case. "It is not tobacco ash, nor is it a fragment of a torn button. It is a constituent component of a very specific, highly specialized piece of Victorian engineering." "A screw?" I frowned, leaning closer. "It is exceedingly small. Where could it possibly have originated?" "Not from the writing desk," Holmes replied, a grim, triumphant smile touching the corners of his thin lips. "Nor from the floorboards of this room. It originated from the interior mechanism of the platinum cylinder itself." I drew in a sharp breath. "The platinum cylinder? But how? When did you—" When I knelt upon the floor to inspect the debris beneath the desk, Holmes explained, his dark eyes snapping with intellectual energy, Napier did not simply wrench the drawer open with brute force, he used the broken ebony shaft of the walking stick as a lever. In doing so, the violent torque he applied to the mahogany facing accidentally scraped against the edge of the heavy platinum puzzle box as it sat wedged in the back. A single microscopic screw on the outer casing of the cylinder sheared off against the splintered wood and dropped into the fibers of the rug. Napier, in his frantic haste to secure the prize and flee the blood-soaked room, never even noticed its absence. "And this screw tells you where he has gone?" I asked, skepticism warring with my absolute hard-earned faith in his genius. "It tells me precisely how he intends to open the box," Holmes declared, stepping back and crossing his arms over his chest. "As I deduced earlier, the 12.5-pound platinum casing is locked by a complex array of numerical dials that require a cryptographic key. But a cylinder of that precise weight, forged in the late 1880s, is not merely a combination lockbox. It is a portable marine chronometer housing, manufactured by the firm of Vickers and Son in Clerkenwell. It operates upon an internal pendulum and a delicate system of jeweled brass gears designed to maintain absolute chronological synchronization even during violent storms at sea." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon me. "If Napier attempts to force the dials without resetting the internal escapement mechanism, a secondary spring-loaded compartment within the cylinder will instantly flood the interior with concentrated sulfuric acid, dissolving every parchment document and ledger contained within into useless carbon," Holmes continued, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "He cannot open it without a master watchmaker's tools, and there is only one horologist in the entire East End of London, a brilliant, disgraced Swiss artisan named Hans Keller, who operates a subterranean workshop beneath an abandoned clock repair warehouse off Ratcliffe Highway, who possesses the specialized skill, the lack of moral conscience, and the precise tools required to dismantle a Vickers marine chronometer casing without triggering the acid trap." I stared at my companion in sheer, unadulterated astonishment. "Ratcliffe Highway, Holmes, that is the most lawless, dangerous quarter of the Docklands. A foreigner stepping into those alleys alone after dark is signing his own death warrant. Which is precisely why Captain Napier will not go alone, or rather, why he will take every precaution to ensure his security while he visits Master Keller," Holmes corrected, turning sharply and snatching his heavy ulster and deerstalker from the peg by the door. "He believes we are neutralized. He believes we are sitting here lamenting our failure while the police hunt for a phantom. He imagines he has hours, perhaps days, before the cylinder yields its secrets." Holmes checked the chambers of his heavy bulldog revolver with a swift, practiced click, slipped the weapon into his side pocket, and turned his gaze upon me, his eyes burning with the bright, irresistible fire of the hunt. "The game is not finished, Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping into a low, thrilling command. "The architect of the abyss has played his master stroke, but he has left his flank entirely exposed. Grab your service revolver, my dear fellow, and button your coat to the chin. We are going to the docks. It is time we paid a visit to the clockmaker of Ratcliffe Highway." Chapter 10. The Clockmaker's Escapement. The journey from the quiet, respectable gentility of Baker Street to the squalid, salt-encrusted labyrinth of Ratcliffe Highway was a descent through the very descending circles of a Victorian inferno. As our four-wheeler rattled eastward past the Bank of England and plunged into the sprawling, soot-choked arteries of the Docklands, the respectable brick facades of the West End gave way to towering maritime warehouses, narrow, cobble-choked alleys, and the omnipresent, mournful wail of steam whistles echoing across the grey expanse of the Thames. The night was as black as ink, the yellow fog having curdled into a heavy, freezing drizzle that plastered our coats to our backs and turned the mud of the wharfside slums into a slick, treacherous paste. Inside the carriage, Holmes sat in absolute, statuesque silence, his tall frame wedged into the corner, his sharp chin resting upon the knuckles of his gloved hand. He had not spoken a word since we crossed Tower Bridge. His mind, I knew, was already traversing the subterranean chambers of the clockmaker's workshop, calculating every variable of the confrontation that awaited us with the mathematical precision of a grandmaster executing a final checkmate. We alighted 100 yards short of our destination, paying the reluctant cabman double his standard fare to ensure his immediate departure, and proceeded on foot through the dripping darkness. Ratcliffe Highway, after midnight, was a desolate theatre of shadows. Low-browed taverns with grease-smeared windows cast sickly bars of amber light across the slush, while the occasional muffled oath or the distant clatter of a dockside crane served as the only reminders of human habitation. Holmes moved with the silent, fluid grace of a stalking cat, hugging the deep, impenetrable shadows of the brick warehouses until we reached a narrow, nameless passage wedged between a defunct rope walk and a rotting timber yard. "Here," Holmes whispered, coming to a dead stop and gesturing toward a low, heavy oak door set deep into the damp masonry, half buried beneath the street level. Above the door, a rusted, unpainted iron sign shaped like an antique pocket watch swung back and forth in the damp wind with a dull, rhythmic creak. Hans Keller's establishment, the subterranean repair vaults of a man who traded his professional integrity for the protection of the East End syndicates. I slipped my hand into the deep pocket of my overcoat, my fingers wrapping securely around the cold, checkered grip of my service revolver. "Is there a back way, Holmes?" "If Napier has already arrived, he will have secured the perimeter." "He will have secured the street entrance, yes," Holmes replied, a faint, cold smile touching the corners of his lips as he drew his heavy bulldog revolver from his pocket and checked the cylinder with a swift, silent flick. But Keller's workshop was originally constructed during the 18th century as a smuggler's vault connecting directly to the drainage culverts that empty into the Thames. Napier is a soldier. He thinks in terms of defensive perimeters and guarded doors. He will not be expecting visitors who arrive via the subterranean sewers. Before I could voice my natural aversion to navigating 19th-century London sewage channels, Holmes had already dropped to one knee beside the heavy oak door. He produced a slender set of steel picklocks from his waistcoat pocket, his long, sensitive fingers working with a speed and dexterity that defied human limitation. There was a faint metallic click, followed immediately by the dull thud of an internal bolt sliding back. Holmes pushed the door open just enough for us to slip through, and we plunged headlong into the damp, subterranean gloom beyond. We descended a steep, winding flight of stone steps that smelled powerfully of stale tobacco, whale oil, and the sharp chemical reek of nitric acid. At the bottom of the stairwell, a faint, flickering yellow light spilled from beneath a heavy, iron-reinforced workshop door, accompanied by the rapid, rhythmic, metallic tick-tick-tick-tick of 1,000 synchronized escapements beating out the seconds like an army of mechanical hearts. Holmes motioned for me to halt, pressing his back flat against the damp stone wall beside the iron-strapped door. He leaned his head forward, listening intently to the muffled sounds filtering through the oak. "You are cutting it exceedingly fine, Keller," a voice muttered from within the room. It was a deep, resonant voice, clipped with the unmistakable authority of a military officer, the voice of Captain Alan Napier. "If the escapement is damaged during the removal of the outer casing, the acid trap will flood the entire compartment, and your life will not be worth the brass filings upon your floor." A second voice, thin, reedy, and accented with the dry rasp of a lifelong Swiss artisan, responded with trembling indignation. "You do not give orders in my workshop, Captain. To disarm a Vickers marine chronometer, housing without triggering the internal pressure plate, requires the patience of a diamond cutter and the steady hand of a surgeon. If you wish the documents intact, you will cease your pacing and keep your hands upon your sword hilt where they belong." Holmes did not hesitate another second. With a sudden, violent heave of his shoulder, he threw his entire weight against the center of the iron-reinforced door. The ancient oak shivered, the rusted hinges groaned in protest, and the iron latch tore cleanly out of the rotting stone frame with a deafening crash. We burst into the subterranean chamber like a pair of avenging specters. The workshop was a bizarre, cavernous vault lined from floor to ceiling with shelves groaning under the weight of hundreds of clocks, pocket watches, gears, and brass instruments ticking in a discordant, deafening symphony. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak workbench, illuminated by the harsh, concentrated glare of a double-wick paraffin lamp. At the bench stood Captain Alan Napier. He had discarded his heavy Inverness cape, revealing a dark, immaculately tailored military tunic across which spanned his gold watch chain. In his right hand, he held a long, razor-sharp military trench knife, its steel gleaming with wicked brilliance beneath the lamplight. Directly before him upon the workbench rested the massive, gleaming platinum cylinder, the 12.5-pound puzzle box, with its outer casing half dismantled to reveal a delicate web of golden brass gears and a small glass vial filled with a clear, bubbling, highly volatile fluid. Beside the bench cowered an elderly man with wild white hair and spectacles perched precariously upon the tip of his nose, Hans Keller, his hands raised defensively before his face, trembling violently. Napier spun around at the sound of our intrusion, his slate-grey eyes widening for a single fractional heartbeat in sheer, unadulterated shock, but the shock vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened fury that transformed his rugged features into a mask of pure malice. "Holmes," Napier snarled, his voice echoing off the stone vault. "You have an intolerable habit of arriving precisely where you are least wanted, Mr. Holmes. And you, Captain Napier, or whatever your true designation within the syndicate happens to be, possess an equally tiresome habit of leaving microscopic pieces of evidence in rooms where you have committed murder," Holmes replied, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable calm as he leveled his bulldog revolver squarely at the center of the officer's chest. "Drop the blade, Napier. The game is played out. Inspector Lestrade and a file of city police are currently securing the upper alleyways, and the drainage culvert behind this building has been plugged with an iron grating. You have nowhere left to run." Napier glanced toward the dark doorway behind us, a bitter, humorless smile twisting his thin lips. He did not drop the trench knife. Instead, his fingers tightened around the bone handle until his knuckles turned white. "Lestrade?" Napier laughed, a short, harsh bark of sound. "You imagine the police can touch me, Mr. Holmes? The documents inside this platinum cylinder detail the names of 3 cabinet ministers, 5 members of the House of Lords, and the entire financial directorate of the Bank of England, who authorized the covert restructuring of the Egyptian debt. If I am arrested, those names go public within the hour, and the British Empire will experience a financial cataclysm compared to which the sinking of the Norfolk is a mere ripple upon a pond. The government does not hang men like me, Mr. Holmes. They offer them a safe passage to Argentina and a pension. The government, Captain, may occasionally tolerate the corruption of politicians and the greed of financiers," Holmes said, his dark eyes narrowing to dangerous, razor-sharp slits as he took one slow, deliberate step forward into the vault. "But it does not tolerate the cold-blooded murder of its own diplomatic couriers, nor the slaughter of foreign financiers upon the hearthrug of 221B Baker Street. Lower the knife. My patience is considerably shorter than Inspector Lestrade's." Napier's eyes darted from the muzzle of Holmes's revolver to the open platinum cylinder upon the workbench, then back to my own weapon, which I had trained steadily upon his right shoulder. A dangerous, desperate calculation flickered across his face, the desperate gamble of a cornered predator, realizing that surrender meant the gallows at Newgate. With a sudden, explosive roar, Napier did not drop the knife. He swept his left arm across the workbench with violent force, sending the glass vial of sulfuric acid careening directly toward the delicate internal gears of the exposed chronometer housing. "If I cannot have the secrets, nobody will," Napier screamed. "Holmes!" I yelled, instinctively tightening my finger upon the trigger. But Holmes was faster than thought. With a motion so blindingly rapid that his arm became a blur, he did not fire at Napier. Instead, he squeezed the trigger of his bulldog revolver, sending a single massive lead slug crashing directly through the wooden workbench, an inch beneath Napier's wrist. The concussive force of the bullet splintered the oak planking with a sound like a thunderclap, jarring Napier's arm so violently that his grip upon the trench knife shattered. The heavy blade flew from his hand, clattering harmlessly against the stone floor, while the sliding vial of acid missed the platinum cylinder by a mere hair's breadth, smashing harmlessly against the stone base of the wall and fizzing harmlessly into a small puff of white smoke. Before Napier could recover his balance or lunge for a secondary weapon, Holmes closed the distance between them with the explosive agility of a panther. He brought the heavy barrel of his revolver down in a crisp, decisive arc across Napier's right temple. The officer's eyes rolled upward. His powerful frame stiffened for a fraction of a second, and then he collapsed like a felled oak, crashing heavily against the stone floor of the vault, utterly unconscious. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the frantic synchronized ticking of 1,000 clocks beating out the seconds upon the surrounding shelves. I lowered my revolver, letting out a long shuddering breath that felt as though it had been trapped in my lungs for an eternity. Old Hans Keller was huddled against the corner, whimpering softly in terror, clutching his white hair in his hands. Holmes stood over the prostrate form of Captain Napier, his breathing steady, his dark eyes devoid of all triumph, wearing only that familiar, profound expression of intellectual completion. He slipped his revolver back into his side pocket, reached down, and carefully lifted the heavy platinum puzzle box from the workbench, inspecting its delicate gears with the tender care of a master surgeon. "The mechanism is intact, Watson," Holmes said quietly, turning to face me with a faint, quiet smile. "The syndicate is broken, the documents are saved, and the architect of the abyss will finally have leisure to contemplate the structural flaws in his grand design." I walked across the littered floor, stepping past the unconscious form of the man who had brought such terror to our door, and leaned against the edge of the workbench. "It was a masterclass in deception, Holmes," I admitted, shaking my head in lingering awe. "From the very first moment he walked into our sitting room and addressed you by name, he had constructed an elaborate stage play designed to draw us into his web." Holmes walked to the small barred window near the ceiling, pushing it open just an inch to let the fresh, clean air of the river sweep away the reek of acid and stale oil. Outside, the freezing London drizzle had finally ceased, and through the parting clouds above the dark masts of the Docklands, a single, brilliant star was beginning to pierce the winter gloom. "He played his part with admirable precision, Watson," Holmes murmured, turning his collar up against the draught as he looked out toward the dark, rolling waters of the Thames. "Yet he forgot the most fundamental rule of deduction." "And what rule was that, Holmes?" I asked, smiling wearily as I holstered my service revolver. Holmes turned, his dark eyes twinkling with that familiar, indomitable fire. "He forgot, my dear Watson, that when a man walks into Baker Street and presumes to name the master of the house, he is no longer playing a game of chance. He is simply writing the final chapter of his own defeat."